Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to HorrorBabble. Today I will be reading a short but brand new story by the elusive M.D. Vickers. This one is called A Pair of Shoes. I hope you enjoy it. A Pair of Shoes by M.D. Vickers. The scene was set in a castle in the south of England. This castle in particular had been turned into a sort of exhibition of 12th century weaponry and other militaria. It was open to the public and attracted quite a lot of attention. The character involved in this true, narrated account was a Mr. Derek Jameson. A doctor by trade, he was heavily interested in this particular era of history. He loved to browse the suits of armor and huge swords and lances. In his mind's eye, he could picture the scene. Jousts, big-busted damsels in distress, the thunderous roar of hooves. Oh, to have lived in those times would surely have been magnificent. A guide was showing him around the old, musty rooms packed full of night-related memorabilia. The guide was droning on, but Jameson was only half listening. He had flipped open the visor on a particular knight's helmet and was peering cautiously in, as if expecting an evil pair of eyes to be glaring menacingly at him.
"Observe the lances, hardly tarnished at all. These would have been used in the jousts of the era."
Jameson lapsed again and rubbed his broad fingers along the edge of a lethal-looking sword. One slight brush with the neck, and donk, head encased in helmet drops to the ground, jetting blood ferociously. Eventually, they left one room and traversed a long hall before they got to another. Their footsteps reverberated around the walls, disturbing the ancient, atmospheric blanket of 800-year-old silence. Oh, if the walls could talk, thought Jameson. If the long-since-heard voices of the past could play back to them in quadraphonic sound. The hearty laughter balanced evenly with the cries of battle, the sound of huge boulders colliding with the castle walls, the creaking and cracking of the drawbridge, the splash of bodies falling into the moat. Jameson snapped back to the present, somewhat unenthusiastically. The guide was once again apparently oblivious to Jameson's distinct lack of attention. He proceeded to ramble laboriously, though this time what he had to say cut through Jameson's attention barrier, and he now appeared interested.
"This castle is haunted, you know. I have actually seen the manifestation myself. Shortly, we will be going down the hall where it occasionally frequents. Whether it will appear today cannot be immediately determined. We shall see."
"What exactly is it that does the haunting?" inquired an eager Derek Jameson. A look of fear passed over the guide's face.
"A pair of night shoes."
Jameson frowned, intrigued. "Just the shoes?" The guide swallowed.
"Just the shoes. They traverse the length of the hall, turn back round, then go back down, and disappear around the corner. After that, they vanish."
Derek Jameson shook his head in awe and bewilderment. "Let's hope it makes an appearance today, then." They carried on their progress, Jameson still browsing, the guide still narrating. 20 minutes later, they got to the part of the castle which housed the alleged haunt. The guide had become noticeably withdrawn. Jameson could smell his nervousness. He himself was beginning to feel the effects of adrenaline, rapidly beating heart and feather-filled stomach. They turned the corner and began to walk down the hallway, their footsteps in perfect sync with each other. "How many times has it been seen?" Jameson asked of the now silent guide. The guide flicked a dry tongue over a dry pair of lips. He looked like a hugely apprehensive lizard. His voice was cracked as he whispered,
"Quite a few times. It is said that footsteps disturb its rest. We shall see."
Onwards they walked, glancing around them, their feet brushing the old floor which had seen centuries of tread. It took a good minute and a half to traverse the long hallway. There was a window at the end, and a pair of rooms on each side. They both turned round, waiting, their breathing heavy and labored. 20 seconds passed with oncoming swiftness. Jameson was about to say something, when there was a loud, echoing clank of a metallic nature, a way off, seeming to emanate from around the corner at the far end of the hall. They both stood, transfixed, staring down the hallway. Another metallic clank, amplified by the silence. A pause. Another. Then another sounded with perfect, monotonous regularity.
It's approaching us,
the guide gasped and wrung his sweaty palms together. The metallic tread quickened. It was approaching the corner of the hall. Then, from around the corner, there came a pair of knight's shoes. Long, silvery pointed metal plates that creaked and groaned as if there was someone inside them, but there wasn't. The shoes moved of their own accord. Jameson uttered a dismayed gasp of horror. His eyes resembled greatly magnified frog spawn as they focused on the nightmarish apparition before him. The shoes picked up momentum. The strides also appeared greater as the hideously eerie footwear advanced. Relentlessly, as if on a purposeful mission, they marched on. Then suddenly they stopped, and both came together with a thunderous chink. Derek Jameson grabbed the guide's arm and shook it. He was beginning to babble and spit. A dark patch had appeared on the front of his beige trousers. The guide was seemingly oblivious to the rattling he was being subjected to. He just stared. The shoes suddenly began to march towards one of the two doors to their left. Then they stopped and turned round. A pause. The shoes then advanced to one of the doors on their right. They stopped outside. Those shoes looked at least 16 inches in length. The door creaked open, and the shoes went inside. There was a dreadful sound of something long being drawn out of some sort of holder. The thick oak door reopened. There, ahead of the shoes, hovered a sword which looked at least 8 feet in length. It was a thin, sharp-looking sword. It made a terrific whooshing sound as it swung through the air. It was at this point that the guide emitted a loud, cracked scream that tore through the atmosphere more than the sword, which bobbed in mid-air in front of him. Jameson just stood, rooted. Saliva swung in a pendulum from his plump lower lip. His eyes had glazed over. When the guide's scream ended in a whistling breath, he staggered forward, then suddenly broke into a shambling run, past the menacing apparition and beyond. The shoes followed him. The huge sword swung ahead in gargantuan arcs. The hallway was filled with the mingled noise of the guide's piercing screams and the hurried tread of the shoes. The guide reached the end of the hall. The apparition was almost upon him. He crashed round the sharp corner, the sword less than 2 feet from the back of his neck. To Jameson's disconnected senses, the sound of the decapitation barely reached his ears. When he finally moved, he was gibbering at the same time. His body reached the corner of the hallway. He turned it and stopped. His bloodshot eyes fell upon the scene before him, and then his vocal cords stretched, and a thunderous bellow of terror released itself. He screamed and screamed and screamed. He continued to scream when the shoes began to creak and groan again, and the blood-drenched sword started up its whooshing arcs. He turned and galloped down the hall, still screaming, feet drumming the floor, the nightmarish entity in pursuit. When he reached the end of the hallway, still keeping up the swift momentum he had achieved, he threw himself at the window that spanned the entire wall and plummeted 20 feet to the ground below. Dr. Derek Jameson spent the remainder of his life in a wheelchair. The fall had snapped his spine irreparably, but this wasn't all that was affected. He was pronounced insane by several psychiatrists who had examined him at length. The rest of his days were spent in a mental institute at his remaining family's behest. One day he decided his suffering had gone on long enough, and he killed himself by repeatedly bashing his head into a door, resulting in 2 fatal blood clots in his brain. The attending nurse who ran to his aid, having been aroused by the colossal noise, said he uttered just one word before he fatally hemorrhaged, and that word sounded like night. Maybe his demons were at their worst at night, they surmised. A sad case regardless, they concluded, and his sister and niece were informed in due course. The conclusion drawn even more substantially thereafter was that Jameson had murdered the guard, then attempted suicide by jumping out of the window. There was no clear evidence on this, however, so the case was eventually slipped into the unsolved cases file and would remain there indefinitely. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support our work here at HorrorBabble, be sure to check out the video description below, where you'll find links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,